This is the ETM Course Podcast. Welcome back to the ETM Podcast. We've had a bit of a hiatus, but we're back in the studio this year and starting off with an episode that I think is of profound importance to anyone in the emergency medical or trauma scene in Australia and New Zealand. A code brown is a nationally recognised code for an external emergency that threatens to overwhelm the capability and capacity of a hospital. On December 14th, 2025, only a few short months ago, several hospitals in Sydney were forced to activate their code brown systems in response to the horrific attack that occurred at Bondi Beach. One of the hospitals that received patients from this incident and activated their code brown system was Royal Prince Alfred, or RPA, in Sydney. In this episode, I'll be interviewing Dr. Matt Oliver, who is the co-director of trauma at RPA, a senior ETM faculty member and a good friend of mine. The focus of this episode is not to detail specific injuries, incidents, patient stories, nor situations that happened that day. Nor are we trying to criticise nor critique any of the systems, processes, or actions by anyone on the day. If anything, the opposite is true, and we would like to publicly acknowledge the bravery, skill, compassion, and care shown by individual healthcare providers and the ability of the New South Wales health system to absorb and provide such high-level trauma care to the victims. The point of this episode is to gain some valuable and rare insights into how code browns and mass casualty incidents actually unfold in real life, as Matt was on shift when this situation unfolded. Before we start, I want to make the following important points. Being reminded about this day may be distressing, particularly for any witnesses, including first responders, the Bondi Surf lifesavers, or anyone else who was at the scene or anyone who knew, is related to, or treated the victims, either pre or in hospital. The purpose of this episode is to educate people in the emergency medicine space about what actually happens in a real code brown mass casualty situation. These are rare events. Some people will never experience it, and we're doing this to share exceptionally rare and valuable experience from a senior clinician who directly treated victims on the day and in the days and weeks that followed. You just can't get this from reading a policy or a guideline or running a simulation. And we're doing it because many hospitals, even some of the larger major trauma centres around the country, actually provide little or no training, simulation, nor useful preparation for these types of events to the hospital staff. And Matt will share some insights into the immense value that preparation and training can have for these types of events. We'd like to pay our utmost respects to anyone and everyone who was affected, directly or indirectly, by this tragedy, and we hope that you're recovering as best you're able to. We also hope that if you, your colleagues, medical friends or acquaintances are ever involved in a real code brown or mass casualty situation, that listening to this podcast will have provided you with some useful knowledge and insights that you can apply on the day. So without further ado, here's myself and Matt Oliver talking about code browns and mass casualty incidents. Okay, so we're here with Matt Oliver, who's the Director of Trauma at RPA in Sydney, an emergency physician and ETM course faculty member and ETM advanced faculty member. Thanks for joining us on the ETM podcast, Matt, and we might get you to just quickly introduce yourself as well to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. As I say, I'm the trauma director or trauma co-director at RPA here in Sydney, and I'm also an emergency department staff specialist.
Yeah, great. And Matt's very generously offered his time to talk to us today about something that kind of shook everyone in the emergency medicine and trauma world. Happened at the end of last year, and we kind of realised in Australia we've been in a bit of a bubble from this stuff for a while, and unfortunately a horrible event happened at Bondi in mid-December, just before Christmas, and Matt happened to be at work that day in Sydney, in one of Sydney's major trauma centres, and we're going to pull it apart a bit. We're very conscious of the fact that this might be upsetting for some people to hear about. We're also conscious of confidentiality and the impact this has had on the patients and victims and the circles of people around them. So we're not going to really delve into specifics. But one point I really wanted to talk to Matt about is this concept of a code brown and what happens when you actually have a mass casualty situation in your ED, and how this played out for the team at RPA that weekend. So Matt, we'll just jump into it, I guess. Can you maybe just describe for us what happened that day, your shift, how it was going, and then how you started finding out that something was going on?
Yeah, so I was working in the ED that shift. I was doing a day shift, and so I had my emergency department hat on, working with my colleagues, and it was about 10 to 7 p.m. where we got some rumors that something was happening, and it was all via social media. So We were sat at the staff base, and then somebody came through and said, "Oh, there's some shooting at Bondi, or something's going on at Bondi." And it was all on social media. So there's a Facebook, there's text messages, there's a few WhatsApp messages, and we got a mixture of information. So the first thing we heard was there's shootings at Bondi. And then the next thing we heard was there's a bomb on the bridge. And when I heard that, I immediately thought the Harbour Bridge, because when people say the bridge in Sydney, you think the Harbour Bridge.
Yeah, gosh.
And then it became real that somebody showed a video of somebody doing CPR at Bondi with a gunshot wound. And it became very apparent within a few minutes that this was a real event. The first instinct was, we don't really know what is real, what's not. And within minutes of seeing that, obviously, those clips that were being sent around, we realized it was a real event. It then became a process of getting everything activated and everything ready. And so we had a quick conversation with me and my colleagues to just have a scope of what was going on in the ED at that time. And we separated out into different teams. So the tricky thing for me is that I'm an ED staff specialist, and my role at that time was in the emergency department, but I'm also the co-director of trauma. So I wanted to be able to stand back a little bit from my ED role and allow my colleagues to get ED ready, whilst I then had to activate a whole bunch of other aspects within the hospital. So I guess we can talk about it in a minute, but the surgeons and anaesthetists, ICU, blood bank, because it became obviously apparent that we were going to get some very sick patients, given our proximity to where the event was, Bondi being roughly about 10-15 minutes away from RPA. So we knew we were going to get some very unwell patients.
Yeah, and I think for people that don't know Sydney, I think St. Vincent's is the closest, isn't it? So they were sort of likely to get the first wave of the sort of bear the brunt initially, but you guys were not much further down the road, so you seemed fairly easy to surmise that you were going to start getting patients. And so when in that sort of time frame did sort of any official notifications start coming through, and what sort of format did that take? Like how did the system activate it? And obviously, again, I really need to really emphasize at the start of this talk that this talk is in no way designed to criticize anyone involved in the emergency services or the disaster system in New South Wales. It's the same in every state. It's the nature of these events that they unfold in a kind of a haphazard way. And that's just their nature, because it's not like there's just you push one button and all of a sudden things get activated. So how did it play out for you guys, Matt?
So that's a really good question, and I think there's going to be an extensive review, going to your point on the pre-hospital communication and the escalation of Code Brown to the different major trauma centres. To directly answer your questions, the event happened at about 6:48 on that Sunday evening, and our Code Brown officially got stood up at 7:51.
So about an hour, roughly.
About an hour to be officially stood up. By that point, we'd actually received one very sick patient, and there were at least 2 or 3 on their way, if not minutes away. So the first patient notification that we got coming through the door was at 19:38. We got a phone call to say there's a guy peri-arrest, he's unwell. And so we recognized that was it was going to be a very unwell patient.
But I guess by that time you'd already sort of started internally drawing resources in.
Yeah, exactly. So what happened in ED? We cleared out resus basically. That was the first thing that we did, and we put a bunch of doctors in there and started making sure that all of our equipment trolleys were stocked and ready, and that the ultrasounds were out, and we had a number of FACEMs allocated to that area, and we then utilized registrars as well. So on that shift we had 4 FACEMs on, and then we had approximately about 6 or 7 advanced trainees as well, and we as soon as we got notification that something's going on, I got onto WhatsApp, and we've got a dedicated WhatsApp group for our ED consultants. And I said, FYI, there's something going on at Bondi, mass shooting. Get on standby and let me know if you're available, sort of thing. And then immediately we got lots of messages saying, "Yep, 5 minutes away, 10 minutes away," and we 2 FACEMs came in. So we had the deputy director of ED came in, and we had another FACEM came in. So we had quite a lot of bodies to be able to help out in ED, and we decided on essentially having a FACEM ED consultant per patient that was coming in. It was really challenging, though, as we've talked about, is knowing how many to activate, because we just didn't get any official notification of what was coming through. We knew that the casualties were going to be numerous, but the numbers did vary. When we were hearing these notifications on social media, it ranged from maybe 10 casualties up to 50. And so trying to work out how many patients we're going to deal with was really hard.
Yeah, look, you've touched on 2 really important points there, I think. One is that concept that if you're at home off duty and you get a message like this, or you hear that something's more likely, if you hear that something's happening, the general advice is don't go to the hospital because you just don't need random people walking in without people knowing you're coming. And you don't want everyone coming for the first hour or 2, because then there's no one covering the next shift and the next shift. But I think that WhatsApp group's a great thing. But yeah, I would say, yeah, wait to be invited or told. If you get 20 replies, you're going to pick 3 people or something. Don't all come in a wave. And I guess the other point you've really hit on there, Matt, and again, I've never been involved in something this high scale, but I've definitely been on shift in EDs where there's like a huge car crash out on a highway, 4 to 6 to 8 potential patients. And again, it's just the nature of these incidents that there's people coming and going in and out of these scenes. The scene is scattered or spread out. It's hard for the paramedics and police at the scene to accurately identify who's a patient, who's not. So it's almost normal, I think, to get that changing information. You'll get one phone call saying there's 3 adults, 2 kids, one's arrested. 5 minutes later, it changes again. Oh, it's 5 adults, 1 kid, no one's arrested. And then 5 minutes later, it keeps changing. It does make it difficult to prepare. But I guess what I'm hearing, Matt, is that you guys just sort of, what do they say? Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Is you got what you thought would be a reasonable number of resources in. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The way I break it down is thinking about stuff, space, in brackets system. And that's where I had the trauma coordinator hat on, thinking, okay, these patients are going to come in through the ED, so we need to obviously prepare the ED, but then they're going to be moving to theaters. We've got to get theaters ready. You've got to get surgeons. We need anesthetists, and we need ICU beds, and we need ward beds to clear off from ICU. And so that's all the space stuff. And by activating Code Brown and the system, hopefully all of that should happen by default. But the problem was that official notification to activate Code Brown is there has to be an official pathway to do that. And unfortunately, I'm not the person who can activate Code Brown. It has to go from the New South Wales Police Commander up to a state coordinator or a SHIOC activator command center to then come across to the CEs of the health district, and it comes down to the clinicians. And so there's this kind of convoluted is a bit controversial, but there's this.
It's a path. It's a complex path. Yeah, and it is. To clarify, Bill, this is very clearly defined in every state and territory. A slightly different path for each place you are, but every state has a crystal clear guideline pathway, whatever you want to call it, that this has to follow. And I guess, mate, we can touch on this point. Some of the reasons for that is because it really does shut down normal business at the hospital, for the whole hospital normally. We can pull this apart a bit as we go on, but I think people sometimes just often wonder, gosh, you heard this thing on the news, wouldn't you just push the button from the ED and fire the flare gun up and say, hey, we need help? But there's some risks with doing that, obviously, that It really does grind the hospital to a halt. It shunts people out of the EDs, it jam-packs people into the wards, the theaters go on standby, operations is cancelled, there's this huge knock-on effect, the labs go on standby, radios, everyone, security, the works, cleaners, everybody.
That's
And
exactly
then
right.
you don't wanna do that for 2 or 3 hours and then go, "Oh, whoops, false alarm, everyone,
Yeah.
back to work."
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's exactly right, especially when there's the information from the scene was being teased out, and from a official standpoint, it was very hard for everybody or anybody to truly know what was going on until, number one, they could actually get into the scene. That was one thing. It was a hot scene. This is somebody who's assaulting patients, and people, that there's lots of casualties on the scene, but there's also perpetrators. So that means that the people getting into that area and getting information was limited by the fact that there's a dangerous two people who are trying to kill folks, and
yeah, I
obviously
think that's something
was on the scene.
That's something I don't really think about is that we're sitting in the ED going, "Come on, surely there's police there, can't they just call us?" And
Yeah,
you're like,
yeah,
"No,
that's right.
no, these are dynamic situations." You think about some of these events in London, for example, they've had the people with, bombings on the buses and the tubes and things, and in France, multiple gunmen at multiple sites. These are highly dynamic, rapidly changing, dangerous situations, so it is hard to get accurate information out.
Yeah, and the nature of the event itself. So the weapons that were used were a high caliber or high velocity, high energy weapon, hunting rifle, and a shotgun, and that the level of tissue destruction and the injuries that were caused by those weapons meant that these patients, unfortunately, were very, very sick, and the paramedics just needed to get those patients off the scene as quickly as possible, especially those who were really severely injured. So there wasn't a huge amount of time, from my understanding, for people to sit there and say, "Oh, there's okay 5 or 6 red patients over there, and there's a few red over there, and we're gonna coordinate X amount going." It was just in the first few minutes, it was moving patients rapidly off the scene when it was safe to get in there and do so. And then when there was a bit more of a coordinated command control structure, then there was the official carouseling of patients to the other trauma centers that were a bit further afield. But that's why in the first half an hour, we had no official numbers, we had no official stand-up, and we didn't know truly what we were dealing with in terms of what type of penetrating injury we're talking about. It would be very different if it was a low-velocity handgun, like a 9mm or something, but this definitely was not the case. This was a significant hunting rifle that was being used, and so it meant that people were very sick and from mostly truncal and junctional hemorrhage.
Mhm.
And so, yes, we had to activate the space, coming back to that question of clearing resus, clearing most of our acute and moving patients up to the ward, which actually happened very well and very quickly, even without the official notification. We just moved people around. Um, and then staffing wise, we'd already allocated teams within the ED and had a few extra people come in for that. And then from my perspective as the trauma coordinator, activating surgeons, and so we activated the trauma consultant who's on, plus others. So we had around 4 trauma consultants come in, and then their fellows and their registrars. And what we realized with the patients as they were rolling in, there was quite a lot of different types of injuries that were needing subspecialty care. So but by that I mean like cardiothoracics, orthopedics, vascular, head and neck surgeon, ENT, plastic surgery.
Yeah.
So a huge range of surgical specialties, which luckily at RPA, we have all of those surgical specialties, and everybody just came in. All of the consultants from those relevant teams came in. So we had a plethora of surgeons um, getting busy very quickly down in theatre. And then to match that, you need anesthetists. So we activated about 9 anesthetic consultants who are each paired with a registrar. Plus we had a few fellows and cardiac anesthetists. And plus the nursing staff that kind of complements all of that. And then we opened up 5 ICU beds that could all be ventilated, and a number of the ICU consultants came in. And one, in terms of staffing, one other really big piece of the puzzle that we found very useful was activating a hematologist. So we've worked on previous simulations and disaster scenario tabletop exercises with our blood bank. And one of my colleagues within blood bank is very passionate about this idea of mass casualty and transfusion medicine. And I had her number on prima speed dial, and I just said, "Hey, Leanne, something's happening. This is bad. You've got to come in." And she raced in her Lululemon outfit and was in our resus bay,
Yeah.
just coordinating where the blood was
I,
going,
I,
which was phenomenal.
I want to get right into the blood thing because we did talk about this offline beforehand, and this is incredible that the way you guys handled this, and I think there's some amazing learning points for people about this. But just to wrap that up, that stuff space system, I think, people that work in ED, one of the take-home messages you're going to get from this podcast is if you haven't looked at your hospital's co-brand policy, you really should. They're 50 pages and intense reading. But what you'll learn is that each department has its own system that will get activated. You don't have to control it all from the ED. But as Matt said, as soon as you mention it to a on-call trauma consultant or a surgical person, there's a pathway for the theatre staff to get activated. And there'll usually actually be some surgeons that come to ED that help with the resus and decision-making and prioritisation and who needs to go to theatre when. And there'll often be a surgeon plus or minus an anaesthetist who aren't hands-on in theatre, just directing the flow in the actual theatres as well and getting resources in the blood and all those sorts of things for those theatre patients. It's actually so these parallel systems all get activated, but the surgeons communicate to each other upstairs, downstairs, who goes when, which theatre, what do they need, what sort of theatre. And like Matt said, if you need subspecialty things, and obviously if you've got high energy mechanisms and lots of tissue disruption, there's a high probability you're going to need things like vascular and plastics initially, potentially. And then again, neurosurge, cardiothoracics, head, neck, all those extra subspecialties.
Just on that topic, Andy, because I found that as my trauma hat on, that was the really useful thing. Part of my role was the trauma coordinator, because I'm not a surgeon, so I'm not busy operating on people. And the trauma consultant who was on came in, and he was very busy, as you can imagine, doing lots of surgery. And our disaster plan has a trauma surgeon to be free and coordinating, but it's actually in our hospital, it's myself and my colleague Dane Chalkley, who are the directors of trauma, and we're both FACEMs. And if you say that nowadays, or in the past, that people go, "Oh, hang on, you're a FACEM, and yet you're doing a trauma coordinator role, or you're taking the role of a trauma surgeon." But I found it, and this is what we've simulated in the past, incredibly useful to have somebody with an understanding of what can be triaged and where they need to go. So we, as FACEMs, we tend to know what patients are stable enough to go to CT, and what patients need orthopedics, and what patients need damage control of surgery, and when something can be managed with IR. And I was able to move down to theatre and follow the patients through, and then to ICU, and working with the coordinating anaesthetist. We actually managed to get a fairly good coordination of what was going on. But it is a unique role. It's not present in all of the major trauma centres, but it's just an interesting point that you make, just on who should have that role. And you do need a good understanding of just trauma principles, and understanding indications for standard things like laparotomy, and who's safe to go to a CT and angiography, that sort of stuff.
Well, I've just had accepted for publication our article surveying all the trauma centres in Australia and New Zealand, specifically looking at these, how many have FACEMs in trauma director roles and surgeons in those roles and shared roles. And the answer is it's wildly heterogeneous, but about 2/3 of trauma centres around Australia and New Zealand now have FACEMs in either trauma consultant or trauma director roles. So it's a growing area. But I think you've hit a really good point there, Matt, that is still a role that takes a bit of experience and working on wards and spending time inside the hospital, not just in the ED, learning how all these trauma patients' pathways go through the hospital and who needs what for what type of injuries and things. Oh, look, maybe should we move on to talk about the blood then? Because I think this is a really important an interesting aspect of this that, it's almost, I almost blame ETM a bit for people generically just throw out, oh, I'd call for a massive transfusion pack and blah, and people don't really think about what that means and the logistics of it, or what's going to happen if you need 10 or 20 or 30 or more massive transfusion packs, how your lab handles that, who the best person is to coordinate that, and what the resources outside the hospital are, because you might just drain your hospital's blood supply, and how do you get more? And we'll get into this, Matt, because you mentioned some stuff that I really hadn't thought of about this when we talked about it. So can you maybe tell us sort of how that played out? You said you called your hematologist, and moving back before that even, you guys had the foresight to actually do some sims and preparation type things, and you had a local champion who was passionate about this, which turned out to make a massive, two things I guess made a big difference on the day for you. One is that prior connection and the contact and knowing the person. The second one is their ability to come and help on the day.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the main point, is knowing who you're working with in the blood bank, and having those relationships prior, and also having an understanding of what occurs when you activate an MTP. What does that actually mean? So it's a Sunday afternoon, and there's, in our place, there's one scientist for RPA who's working in a blood bank.
Yep.
If we hadn't given them any information that a mass casualty was ongoing, they would have been completely overwhelmed within a few minutes. But luckily, we have talked about this, and we have simulated this type of scenario in the past. So we've done 2 simulations involving a blood bank, one being a large-scale emergo exercise that was based in ED, moving to theatres and then to ICU, and then another smaller tabletop type exercise that was just sat in a room and discussing a mass casualty situation, but specifically with the blood bank staff. So we had hematologists, we had the blood bank scientists, and then we also had members of Lifeblood who are based in Alexandria, which is only 10 minutes away from us, who are at that tabletop exercise as well. So even before going into the big event with Bondi, we'd had established those relationships, and we'd thought about how we would move large volumes of blood from blood bank to wherever it needs to be in the hospital, whether it's emergency theaters or ICU. But also then thinking about movement of blood from Lifeblood, which is the main hub for depositing or sending blood out to all the hospitals within pretty much New South Wales. Is my understanding that Alexandria receive all of the donated blood in New South Wales, and they fractionate it all out and then ship it all out to wherever it needs to go. And we're just very fortunate that we're close by to that large blood bank in Alexandria.
But you made a good point to me before, Matt, which is something I hadn't thought of, these mass casualty situations. It's really important to think about this stuff beforehand, because the place might be close, but what if the incident is between you and the local blood source? The roads might get closed, sorts of things. So you might actually get cut off on your supply.
That's exactly. We actually found that once with a patient. We had a patient who was run over by a truck just outside the hospital, and the police completely shut down the roads. And we managed. She was in arrest when she came in, and we transfused around 120 units of products within about 1 to 2 hours for her. And so we depleted all of our platelets within a few minutes, really, gone through. And so it became a real issue for Lifeblood to actually deliver us more units of products. And there were a lot of conversations about, do you use drones? And then somebody made the point, well, if a drone's flying towards a hospital with a big box, what are you going to do? So maybe somebody
You're going to let that land on the roof. Yeah, no.
So we've decided on using like a green light corridor, where the police will essentially help transport through the closures, and ensuring there's good communication there.
And I think that the spin-off conversations we could have about this in various states, I think sort of in rural New South Wales and potentially in Queensland, there are systems where the police will transport blood between local towns even. So I think you're definitely going to need some official red and blue light vehicle that's able to get around those problems.
And so that night on Bondi evening, the first, after a few calls to surgeons and anaesthetists and intensivists, I also called back the hematologist that I knew quite well and worked on a number of these protocols with. And she came in immediately And she subsequently had also activated her scientists. So she had brought in another 3 extra scientists to help in blood banks. They had 4 scientists in the blood bank, and then Hemovigilance, CNC, and a couple of others. And then importantly, she contacted Lifeblood and said, we're going to need more blood. And so we got a deposit of 342 units of extra blood products. That's not just packed cells, obviously, but also cryoprecipitate, FFP. And so that big shipment of blood products came over 2 different shipments divided into over the course of about 4 or 5 hours. And we used 117 units in 5 hours. And we actually only wasted 1 because of cold chain and non-compliance.
Gosh, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was really cool to have the hematologist right there in the resus bay initially and going around everybody saying, what blood products do you need? Have you sent up for cross match? And where are you up to in your MTP kind of process? We actually moved away from a standard MTP of what would be 4 packed cells initially with 2 plasma, and then you get pack B, C, etc., etc. And it was a single unit derived, so meaning that the clinicians would say to the hematologist, okay, I've used 3 red and I now want 3 plasma, as the hematologist would get that dispatched immediately, and the blood bank would just dispatch either 4 or 5 units of said product, whatever they needed, and each blood sheet is going to be just as a single unit rather than many units. And all of the blood then the idea would be go to the hematologist who's keeping it in our blood fridge, and then would just dispense it to whoever would need it within our ED. And so that became really useful. And then we all kind of moved down to theaters and did the same sort of thing down in theaters and then into ICU. And luckily, when the patients were then moving to ICU, the MTP kind of process or that transfusion was settling down.
Do you think that
It
helped
became
with,
really useful.
oh yeah, one of the things I find in these situations that's really hard is keeping track of who's had what. And when you get a box that has mixed products in it, and the blood nurses in ED just call over, what do you want next? And the hand goes in the box and something goes up, and then the second pack arrives and random things go up, and next minute you've got a bunch of random empty bags and a few bags going, and it's very hard to keep track of. Do you think that helped sort of for each individual patient, keeping track of what everyone's saying?
It was still very difficult to know where we were in terms of the ratios. And looking at our numbers, we're still behind on our plasma. We did very well in packed cells, and we actually transfused a lot of early cryoprecipitate.
Yeah, right.
And speaking to the anaesthetist, that was because they were actually running TEGs quite early on, or rotums actually. And so they had an idea of what was going on with the patient's coagulation profile, and they decided to use cryo early on. And then platelets, same. We actually not too bad on the platelet ratio compared to our packed cells, but we didn't use a huge amount of plasma, which was one of the interesting things. And in retrospect, maybe we should have used a bit more plasma than we should have done. But like you said, it was a bit chaotic in the first instance to know exactly where the ratios were. But having the hematologist, and we also had a hematology registrar who was down in theaters and was up in ED, who could try and keep some coordination of where they were in the ratios and what was being used. It just offloads a little bit of that thinking. That was one of the points made by the anaesthetist, that they really didn't have the mind frame to be able to say, oh, how many are we up to 1-to-1 and everything. It was just, help me out here, I need blood, just make it happen. And the hematologist was really good at doing that.
Yeah, I can't think of a downside really to having them there. It sounds like it would have been a really useful thing to have. Is there any other tips you've got for anyone before we wrap up on the blood? I think it's, did you find, you still remembered your calcium, your TXA and all those other things, and keeping people warm, and it all sounds good on paper, but when
I haven't looked at how much calcium and TXA people got. I know the first patient who was really sick, they got TXA in quite a bit. But it's a good question on calcium. not sure. One topic that did come up was the use of factor concentrates, and if we're really depleting our cryoprecipitate, whether we move to fibrinogen concentrate, and that is possible. We do have fibrinogen concentrate in our blood bank, and mostly for that type of situation where we're just depleting all of our cryo, whether it's because you've got some really sick postpartum hemorrhage or you've got a mass casualty situation like we had. So that came up, which we only thought about towards the end of the scenario, but the end of the situation. But luckily at the time we didn't need it. We had actually enough cryo to get people through.
I think you've made so many good points with this, Matt, and I think one of them is that the preparation component and talking about it before it happens and doing some sims and exercises and things, and then also having a person there on the day. And I just think it means you're much less likely to be sort of wasting. You clearly didn't hardly wasted anything, you said, but you're not going to be wasting products, giving the wrong products or the wrong sequence, so your probability of getting that right is going to be so much higher. And at the end of the day, that's what most of these severe penetrating trauma patients die from, is exsanguination. So it's super important. Yeah, look, you dropped a couple of words earlier that I want to go back to, just to clarify for people, just before we sort of move past the ED phase for this, and is you dropped some color code names for red and yellow and different categories of patients that might be coming in, and I wanted to pull that apart a bit as well, about partly to do with how you allocated space in your ED for those potential patients. I think that's something that people get taught a bit, is that there'll be some critical patients coming in that clearly need to come into resus, then there are going to be the less severely injured people and they need somewhere to go, and then there's going to be what they call sort of the walking wounded, the people with cuts and scratches and just panic or whatever, that don't really need to be seen urgently. And so how did you guys hear about those? Did you get actual specific sort of color code categories given to you beforehand, and then when people were arriving, how did you sort of manage the flow of people through the ED?
That's so good question. The official answer is that we would do 2 levels of triage and use our disaster tags and use that coordination through our disaster tagging system and allocate them to red, yellow, green, or deceased. In reality, honestly, we just didn't have time to do that. We had, in total, we only had 7 patients within a course of within 6 within an hour, and we had 1 interhospital transfer that came a little bit later on. And of those 6, 1 was a walk-in, so that's automatically green, who had a gunshot to the leg. They were fine, walked in. And then of the 5, 4 were really, really sick, and it was very obvious that they needed to go straight to resus, and they needed a team allocated to them, and the majority of those needed urgent surgery.
So they're the sort of red ones, they will call them
the red, the P1, that kind of, they're urgent, they're dying, get them into resus. And then most of them went straight down to theatre with the surgical team, and then to ICU. So the triage system that we deployed was minimal. It's just get them into resus. They're really sick. We've just got to start working on them. But if we started if it was going to be multiple casualties, or we had more advanced warning of what type of patients we were going to get, then we would deploy a 2-tier triage system. But unfortunately, we just didn't have the process to do that, because it actually wasn't necessary at that time.
Yeah.
And this kind of comes back to the complexities of trauma disaster systems and mass casualty systems, that our disaster protocol is, I think it's about 50 or 60 pages long, and there's a flow chart that is convoluted and complex. And I think that's fine, but for a slow onset of a disaster, like a big flood or a building that goes down, where you're going to have a long pre-hospital time for these patients, versus this scenario where there was penetrating injury of severely injured patients who were mostly bleeding, and we needed to just get them to theatre quickly. So there's two ends of the spectrum really, and how your disaster protocol fits into all of that really, it depends on the timing and the type of disaster that we're talking about. And unfortunately, we were right down on that other end of the spectrum of penetrating sick patients, just got to move quickly.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that these things can happen in any sort of mechanism, things like plane crashes or, like I said, a building collapse, or, a building gets blown up or that sort of thing, where it's going to take potentially quite a bit longer to find victims and extricate them and sort them at a scene and get them out. But this was a very, maybe there was a brief initial delay because the scene was still live, but once it was sort of controlled and they could move bodies, they all moved very quickly, which can make the best laid plans hard to implement. Yeah.
The other important thing to just mention, I guess, is we're actually lucky from a disasters perspective in Sydney that we have 6 major trauma centres.
Yes.
The disaster actually doesn't completely overwhelm one hospital, 1 or 2 hospitals, but it will do for the paramedics and the pre-hospital teams. It's a disaster in that scenario, and it might overwhelm the resources in that area. But for the hospital, we actually found that we managed the patients who came in urgently, and we did have capacity to take more. And it was purely because of the carouseling of all the other patients around to the other trauma centres. And so each state obviously has a completely different setup and geography, but that was the one benefit of having quite a few 6 major trauma centres in Sydney that could occur. And the amazing thing was, and this only dawned on me after some debriefs, that there's a command. The medical commander was a retrievalist, Dr. Chris Pardick, who I think you've had on.
But oh yeah, Chris has been on the podcast. Yeah,
he helped carouseling once he got on scene, but he helped not only carousel patients to the different centres, but was thinking about what type of injuries the patient had. So a gunshot to the chest would go to St. Vincent's, and then an abdomen would go to RPA, and then a leg injury is going elsewhere. So thinking not just the moving of patients, but also the type of surgery that goes on. And that's a phenomenal piece of forethought to think about the overwhelming of a particular type of surgery that's going on. And really that's an experienced clinician to be thinking along those lines in the field, to be able to do that and move the patients to the right place in the right time, but also with the right type of surgery and not overwhelm one particular surgical specialty, which is amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's full credit to everyone to have had a system in place and have activated it in such a chaotic and dangerous situation, and have dispersed people so sensibly, it would seem. And I guess, as we all know, if you've been around the scenes long enough, you've been involved in some big situations. There's often, there's a retrospectoscope gets applied down the track, and there may be some critique of things, but I think on the whole, really, it sounds like things were handled pretty well. Matt, I might just bring up a couple of points that we mentioned beforehand about security. You mentioned I think this is an important point that people don't potentially think about, and I think because gunshot wounds are relatively uncommon in Australia. We don't really see that many, to be honest. We see 95+% blunt trauma and 5% penetrating. A fraction of those are gunshots normally, and a lot of those are self-inflicted or just a very, I don't want to say minor, but a little tiff between 2 people, and it's just a little one-off thing. But we don't, I guess we're lucky in this country, we haven't had to think about the broader implications, the things you should think about when a shot person comes into the ED around securing the hospital. And can you maybe talk to that a little bit and how that played out?
Yeah, this has come up mostly on my perspective only after the event, because we didn't know the nature of what was going on at the scene and the motives behind it. And it's only afterwards that people were commenting about the role of security and locking down the hospital. I think other hospitals did do that very well. St Vincent's, who are just down the road from us, essentially locked down the hospital quite early on. We did a similar sort of thing, but employed security to come in, and the number of entrances and exits in our hospital is just incredible. And
Yeah.
I know it's the same at others. And there was a comment from a colleague at who said that there was an Uber driver just wandering around on one of the wards,
Like an
delivering
Uber Eats
food,
delivery guy.
doing Uber Eats. Sorry, yeah, not Uber driver, Uber Eats. And they were like, "Who's this guy?" So,
Chief.
yeah, they're definitely security becomes a big issue, and that is the benefit of activating the system, because our medical executive took care of that, and were looking and making sure that the front door was secure, and that also people could get access. So that was one of the challenges for the blood delivery person, that they actually heard that some of the normal entrances were locked, and they had to get access through different means. But it's something that as clinicians, you really don't want to have to be thinking of that sort of stuff, and
Yeah.
want somebody else taking care of it. It was the same with social workers, and contacting next of kin and dealing with the media. I did not have any headspace, and I know a lot of my colleagues who are clinicians didn't have the headspace to be able to deal with that, because that's a huge, big piece of work, and especially in this incident that. There were a number of relatives, unfortunately, who were moving from hospital to hospital trying to find their loved ones. And a lot of the time we didn't know who these patients were. They weren't identified early enough. And the role of the social worker and the medical executive unit to be able to come in and help do that aspect, and also dealing with the media and the family next of kin, was so important. But like you say, also security was really high up. But it just was not the front part of my head, when I was dealing with these patients. But
Yeah.
luckily, they could deal with that.
Yeah, I think that's such a great description of those issues, and I think it's something that I learned many years ago when I was a registrar early on at one of the trauma centres in Melbourne, and I rocked into my shift for the afternoon, and there was a patient who just died from a gunshot wound there, and there was all these sort of mafia sort of looking family standing around, and my consultant who came on the afternoon shift just stopped in his tracks and said, "Who's that? Who are those people? And where the hell is security?" Because yeah, and what you don't realize in sort of maybe not terrorist related things, but we'll talk about that in a sec, is that if someone gets shot and they survive, there is sometimes an incentive for the shooter to come in, or a connection of theirs to come in and finish the person off in hospital, and pose as a relative or some benign person and make their way in and then shoot someone in the ED. And I think our colleagues in the States are much more onto this than we are, because they see it all the time, and they have structural systems in their EDs as far as having entrances on separate floors to the actual ED itself. You can actually strap people in lifts and things, and if you think they look suspicious, stop them actually getting in. And I guess from the terrorist point of view, again, it's potentially not a huge thing, but it's not out of the realms of possibility that a hospital could become a target as well. And I think in some war zone type places, I know Jenny Jamison, who's worked overseas for MSF, worked at a hospital that not long after she left became a target in a war zone, and several of her colleagues were killed. So it is just something that, again, you're going to be cognitively maxed out dealing with the clinical stuff in front of you. And as a clinician, you don't want to be trying to think about this stuff as well. So I think it just highlights that importance of the system getting activated.
Yep.
All right. And so obviously this was a big rush of really sick patients, Matt, and then they sort of got moved through, the dust kind of settled. And how did the sort of stand down process go then?
That took a long time. So because of the bombs on the scene, the IEDs, the actual stand down process, I think, had occurred at around midnight. So it got stood up at 10 to 8 and stood down at midnight. And that was because of the communication from the scene, that police just wanted to make sure they'd found everything. And I'm assuming that's the case. And so we had a lot of staff kind of lingering around. It's a Sunday evening, and a lot of surgeons, and there was probably some thought, well, I've got my surgical list tomorrow. We've got to get to busy. You know, am I going home? What am I doing? You know, what's going on? But it gave us a chance to just, like you said, the dust settled. A lot of the patients were through surgery and in intensive care. We had a lot of extra surgeons, anesthetists, intensivists who are in our ED, and it gave us a little bit of a breath, and we could just go through what's just happened, give it a little recap, and almost like a hot debrief.
Yeah.
And then we actually, because we knew that time there were bombs, we just went through in a bit more of a structured approach. Okay, if we are going to get more, this is our actual plan. This is what we're going to do in a more coordinated way. And so we could plan a little bit more. And luckily, as you know, we didn't need any of that. The bombs were controlled, and it did get stood down later on. The interesting thing was that about midnight or 1 a.m., there was a very sick patient that came through our ED who was in cardiogenic shock and peri-arrest. And
So they're totally separate, not from the scene.
totally separate. Yeah, they were not involved in the disaster. And they needed to go on to ECMO within a few minutes, and we put the patient on VA ECMO, and it was just fortuitous that the cardiac anaesthetist has been still was hanging around, and obviously we had intensivists there who could cannulate the patient, so it was very lucky for that patient that we were all there.
Gosh, that's amazing. Well, it's again one of the hidden benefits of activating the system.
Yeah.
Gosh. All right. So Matt, I want to just peel back a little bit, and you mentioned a couple of the preparation and training exercises you did, or you have done prior to this event. Could you maybe talk to some of those? You've given me some good insight into the different types and things you can do that help in this situation, some of the benefits of prior preparation. And obviously, you know, everyone knows preparation is good, but you had some really specific wins, I think it sounded like, from the work that you'd done beforehand when this situation unfolded.
Yeah. Our disaster coordinator within our hospital has actually been pushing to run a true disaster scenario, a MOGO exercise, for many months, maybe years. And we have run a couple about 5 years ago. And the disaster coordinator said to exec, we really got to get this going. It's very important. We were peripherally involved in the Hunter Valley bus crash, and then there was the Sydney, the Bondi stabbing opposite the Westfield Mall, and I think that was one of the impetuses to just get things up and running. And there are various different types of simulations that you can run, ranging from a whole of hospital, pre-hospital ED, and through all the way to ICU, or you could just keep it focused within a particular department, or you could just use tabletop. And we've run a variety of those over the past 5 or 6 years. But the most recent one that we did do was an emergo exercise using little goobers, and we had a kind of
What's a goober?
a little picture of a person, and on the back of that you have details of what their injury is. So a little thing that you can stick to the wall and say, this is Mr. X and Mr. Smith, and he has 58 and he's got a gunshot to the abdomen. And to be honest, the one that we ran was very artificial. I think I said this to you before. We did 15 laparotomies within about 10 minutes or something ridiculous. Like it was a bit artificial. That's an exaggeration.
Yeah.
We moved a lot of patients through the system, but we had, I think, 30 or 40 casualties, and we had a number of players in that. We set up a mini ED, and we moved those patients. They had to be carried, so the little goober had to be carried to the surgery department, and that person had to then have their operation, or they went to CT, or they went to angio, and so they had to be kind of transported around. It wasn't using mannequins, and it wasn't high fidelity, but the purpose was really coordinating surgery. The focus of that simulation was all about surgery, so involving our surgeons, involving our anaesthetists, and also we had the benefit of a blood bank. They wanted to come and play with us, so they got involved, and we had little packed red cells and little packed plasma units that were being dispensed everywhere. And it was a great exercise, mostly because it just cemented in a lot of people's minds of who they need to call and what their role would be in that scenario. And so we'd be able to delineate the ED commander and the nurse commander, and then a trauma coordinator and an anesthetist who was coordinating from the ED through to theaters, and all of those different roles that are in disaster plans that exist within hospitals. Um, and that just built relationships, it built understanding, and it built a knowledge of the roles that the people would pick up when something like this unfolds. And luckily, a lot of the people who were involved in those simulations were on or aware or involved on that Bondi day. So it actually was just very lucky to some extent, but also it was because we knew who to call and get involved because we'd run it before.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing. It's I don't know anyone that's ever been involved in any sort of training like that, a hospital-wide system type preparation, who's got to the end and gone, "Oh, that was useless. That was dumb. We shouldn't have done it." It's there's always some positive knock-on effects, and I think you touched on the key word there about relationships as well. It can just make a big difference. If you're in a massive hospital, there is a chance that there's so many people working there, and the people that are on call might not be people you've worked with before, and they may not have done the simulation. But if a critical enough mass of people have, like you said, at least there'll be some institutional knowledge there and some connections to make stuff go more smoothly.
So I guess one message is to just in your institution, wherever you work, is to know who your disaster coordinators are and to try and champion some form of simulation, whether it's a simple tabletop thing within your ED or a hospital-wide using mannequins and high fidelity. It all depends on what your exec can support and how far you're willing to go. But it's definitely worthwhile thinking ahead and planning.
Yeah, you can make it as simple or as complicated as you like, but it will still have a beneficial effect, I think. Yeah. Yeah, look, we might just move on and just wrap it up then. Matt, obviously, events like this can have fairly major knock-on effects and psychological impacts on people, and some people just are in business mode, and yeah, it was terrible, but, I just need to do my job, and other people might have some lingering thoughts about it. And how did that play out for your team and everyone at RPA? In the sort of maybe that immediate phase and in the
question.
delayed.
And I think there's still a lot of people processing what's happened, obviously being such a horrific event and the motives behind it. We have done a number of debriefs with a hot debrief that evening, and also cold debriefs within the departments that are involved, but also through kind of bigger hospital-wide debriefs. And there are a number of different opinions as to how people cope in those scenarios. From a personal level, I found it was because the patients that we received, we actually did I felt like a really good job, not speaking for me, but the hospital, the system, and all the clinicians did such an incredible job. I actually walked away thinking, well, that was crazy, but we actually did a really good job. And speaking to a number of the nurses and clinicians in the emergency department, the majority felt like that was the case, that because the work that was done was a great job, and we managed to save a number of patients, and the outcomes of those patients was good. I think morale was reasonably high for the majority. Now, I can't speak on behalf of people who felt otherwise, because there are obviously some people who felt that it was very difficult to deal with, and especially since the incident occurred in an area where a lot of our staff live or know people who in that community, the Jewish community. And that, I think, has been extremely challenging for those who either know people who are there and were affected, or have relatives there, or likewise. So it's a challenging thing to debrief and discuss. One of the other really important things I found incredibly useful, and this is again with my trauma hat, as I rounded on all of the patients for the days afterwards, and I could see them recover and they get better. There was one chap who had a really severe abdominal wound, and I saw him on day 2. He was still intubated, but he was giving me the high fives, giving the fist bumps, and he was smiling. And I thought that is incredible for him to survive such a horrific injury and to have such a positive outlook. And for that, it gave me actually quite a lot of closure in what happened, and it helped me heal and kind of get better. And in terms of psychologically, I could see the outcome of what we were doing, and it it I realized that that wasn't the same for some of my ED clinicians. That some of them were actually affected because they didn't see the good outcome of what happened. Um, and I managed to take one of my ED colleagues to go and see one of the victims on the ward, and they found it incredibly useful to sit there and kind of joke with them and have share some experience in the matter, and those tears and those laughter, and it was incredibly useful for them. And that's, I think, one of the challenges of what we do in emergency medicine is that sometimes we don't get to see the outcome of the patients that we look after, that they move through the system either quickly or we don't get closure on what's happened.
Well, the conveyor belt just keeps turning, and you might want to, but there's just that next wave and the next wave, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So one message would be to, if you can, go out to the ward, go down to ICU if you have that capability, or even bring patients back into meetings and say hi if they're willing to do that, and just get some of that feedback, because I think especially in this instance it was so important to get some of that closure. So yeah, I think that was one of the useful strategies that was used. And then it's making sure that people are okay, just touching base and saying, okay, how are you doing? There's the employee assistant program, and here's some numbers to call. If you need any help, we're here. And I've got to say, our executive unit were very useful for that and very supportive. And so was our mental health team in the hospital. And there was everybody who was involved that evening got contacted from within our emergency department and from the executive unit. So that was something that was done quite well, actually.
Oh, that's good to hear. And I was involved in an incident many years ago as a junior doctor that I thought was handled exceptionally well. It was an extremely frightening, traumatic event with an armed patient, sort of threatening a bunch of people. And I wasn't directly threatened, but I kind of saw the person, and I was sort of peripherally involved. Definitely had an impact on me. And the hospital again activated such a good system as far as time off and stage return to work and contact with the actual, psych consultants, not just here's a phone number to call some external service. It was actually high level clinical support and check-ins and whatnot. And I probably underestimated at the time the impact that situation had on me. But as I've gotten older, I always look back at that and thought, God, that was well handled, and made a huge difference in my ability to kind of move on and feel okay and get back to work. So I think that's full credit to your hospital for going to that length for everyone, and I hope everyone that was involved is okay and making some sense of it and being able to get back on the horse, so to speak, because these events can derail some people and make them question their job, or maybe want to tap out of working in ED. We need people to not leave the emergency medicine system. There's been a huge attrition of nurses over the last few years, and there's a lot of ED consultants getting burnt out and whatnot, and events like this can really have quite profound impacts on people. So it sounds like it was handled pretty well at your hospital then.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Look, we might wrap it up there, Matt. I think that's just been such a useful reflection and some such valuable insights into people's experience on this day and what it actually looks like from the coalface or from the front end when you're actually directly involved in one of these situations, because this actually triggered me to go and review my own hospital's co-brown policy, which, as you said, is massive and convoluted, and I ended up synthesizing into a newsletter and dispersing it for our colleagues in a sort of a synthesized format, just to give people some visualization of what it actually looks like. But you can you can read all the guidelines you like and go look at the coloured vests and the cards and all these things. Uh, but hearing a first-hand account of how these things actually play out, and again, I really want to reiterate to anyone who's listening to this who may think that we're in any way being critical of these systems not working or somehow being dysfunctional. That's absolutely not the point. The point is that the systems exist for a reason, to give these things some structure and clarity, and they've been pre-thought about, but it's just the nature of these situations that can be unpredictable and heterogeneous and really hard to put this chaotic sort of external thing into a controlled situation in the hospital. And I guess that's kind of the point, is to try and at least help convert that chaos into some sort of controlled situation. And it sounds like your team did an amazing job at that, Matt, and full credit to you for sort of helping with that.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think everybody did an incredible job, not just within our hospital, but every hospital, and especially the pre-hospital teams.
Yeah.
There were also lifesavers, lifeguards involved, as you would have seen in the media, and everybody in that environment was sounded completely chaotic.
Just talking about the 6 degrees of separation affect your staff who knew people, the ripple effect of this was profound, to the point where my wife's one of her best friends' sister is part of the Bondi lifeguard team and was there on the day and directly involved in the scene. And, within an hour of it starting, we heard that she was there and actually involved and helping drag people out and stuff. And the way that, that traveled interstate into our lounge room on that night was incredible. So, and I know there's so many people much more impacted than that and much more closely affected than that, and still kind of reeling from it. And I hope that this episode has provided some useful insights for people, maybe even inspires people to go back to their hospitals tomorrow when they listen to this, start asking around, ask what your policy is. If you haven't prepped for it, you haven't practiced, done a sim, even talked about it, thought about it, I think it's a good time to actually, for people to start just maybe dusting off the policies, talking to people, going to meet people. Like you said, I think it's inspirational to hear that you guys have put that amount of effort in, and the benefit of those relationships and just having some contact and a bit of foresight about how these things play out. So God forbid, should it happen, and it can happen anywhere is the other thing. There can be a bus rollover in a country town out near Forbes or Orange or Dubbo or God knows what, that may still need some kind of version of this. So and anywhere in Australia or New Zealand, this can definitely happen. So I can't thank you enough, Matt, for sharing your insights.
No problem, Andy.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Hopefully it was useful and people will get some learning takeaways from it.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Okay. Cheers, mate.
I'd like to extend my personal thanks again to Matt for taking the time to speak to us today and for sharing those incredible insights into what must have been a really challenging and stressful shift. But it sounds like the team at RPA handled it all incredibly well, as did everyone at all of the other hospitals in Sydney who received patients from this event, as did all of the pre-hospital providers and first responders. I personally learned a lot talking to Matt about his experience, and I hope you can all get some useful takeaways from this, particularly the value of practice, training, simulation, and possibly most importantly, relationship building between different teams and specialties within your hospital, so that if and when a co-brown or a mass casualty situation occurs, the systems, processes, and people involved will be familiar. So that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. We're going to be pumping out many more episodes this year. If you're an emergency registrar, consultant, rural generalist or GP, anaesthetist, intensivist or surgeon who treats trauma patients and you haven't done an ETM course, please check out our website etmcourse.com. We've got courses running around Australia and New Zealand this year, and ETM is the only trauma course that teaches the modern, team-based approach to trauma reception and resuscitation. If you've done ETM and you want to take things up a notch and learn how to manage critically ill, peri-arrest or arrested patients, including pediatric, geriatric, and obstetric trauma, check out ETM Advanced. And just a reminder, you must have done ETM as a prerequisite for doing ETM Advanced. If you work in a mixed or a PEDS ED, or you're a PEM person, or you want to learn specifically how to manage pediatric trauma, we've also got the brand new PTM, or Pediatric Trauma Management course, which just ran for the first time last weekend, and there are a few more scheduled during the rest of this year. And lastly, if you don't want to do a face-to-face course, check out etmonline.com. For now, we have the TOX course, modules 1 to 4, with more topics coming later this year. And I've got to say, module 4 of the TOX course is perhaps the best online course module you'll ever see or do. That's Jeff Isbister, Ingrid Burling, and Nick Dafter's TOX gurus doing the bite, stings, and envenomation module, and it is absolutely worth every penny. And you can find that at etmonline.com. So just remember, you can hope the trauma call goes well, or you can train so it does. So book yourself a place on an ETM, ETM Advanced, or PTM course soon. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.